amid the rolling mountains of Wales, where mist regularly drifts through the valleys like a natural curtain, there stands a structure that once compelled all of Europe to fall silent and take notice. It was not a medieval castle built from legend, nor a royal palace sustained by inherited power. It was Craigside, a mansion born of industry, of metal, of water pressure, and of an almost absolute belief that humanity could reshape the world through technology and ambition. Craigside does not rest upon the land like other great estates. It clings to the mountainside above the town of Llandudno, where steep and unforgiving terrain has long forced architecture to submit to nature. But Craigside does not submit. From the beginning, it was designed to confront its surroundings, as if declaring that nature was no longer the final limit of progress. Behind this structure stood William Armstrong, one of the most influential engineers and industrialists of the 19th century. Armstrong was not born into aristocracy, nor did he inherit land or title. He was a pure product of Britain's industrial age, an era in which technical skill could replace bloodline and invention could open the doors of power. Armstrong first gained prominence not through Craigside, but through weapons. The artillery he designed transformed naval warfare across the British Empire. His factories at Elswick became symbols of industrial might, where steel, steam, and human labor merged into a force of global reach. Yet it was at Craigside that Armstrong revealed a deeper ambition, not merely to control markets or technology, but to control the very environment of daily life. When Armstrong purchased the land on this mountainside in the 1860s, it held only a modest rural house. Over the following decades, he continuously expanded, altered, and restructured it, until Craigside became a vast and complex architectural system of more than 100 rooms, stretching across the terrain like an artificial organism. There was no final blueprint. Craigside existed in a permanent state of becoming, reflecting Armstrong's own conception of progress, never finished, never sufficient. What set Craigside apart from every other mansion of its time was neither size nor luxury, but energy. In 1881, Craigside became the first private home in the world to be fully illuminated by hydroelectric power. While most of Europe still relied on gaslight and candles, Craigside operated an integrated system of water turbines, electrical generators, and internal wiring, all embedded directly into the fabric of the building itself. Electric light at Craigside was more than a convenience. It was a declaration. Every switch that flicked on was an assertion that the future had arrived earlier than expected, and that it belonged to those with the means to build it. Yet that light also carried a shadow, less immediately visible, because to sustain this system, Armstrong diverted natural streams, constructed artificial reservoirs, and transformed an entire mountainside into a machine serving a single residence. In that sense, Craigside was not merely a mansion. It was an experiment, a miniature model of the industrial world Armstrong believed could function flawlessly if properly engineered. Each room reflected an aspect of industrial thinking: central heating systems, hydraulic elevators, mechanized kitchens. Life within Craigside no longer followed nature. but unfolded inside an environment calculated, measured, and optimized. Yet this very optimization exposed a fundamental contradiction. Craigside was built to demonstrate that technology could deliver absolute control, and in doing so, it revealed the cost of that control. The house consumed resources, labor, and maintenance at a scale only an individual of immense wealth could sustain. Craigside could not exist independently of Armstrong's industrial empire. It was a byproduct of weapons manufacturing, warfare, and an economic system dependent on relentless expansion. Walking through Craigside's long corridors, one senses more than the refinement of Victorian architecture. There is a quiet tension between beauty and power, between progress and appropriation. The house always feels larger than human need, as though it was built not to be lived in, but to prove an idea that the future could be designed, owned, and sealed behind walls of stone. The opening chapter of Craigside's story is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It does not begin with collapse or loss, but with triumph. And yet within that triumph, the seeds of darkness were already sown. Because when a home becomes a symbol of industrial power, it also becomes a reminder that every ambition ahead of its time leaves traces behind, not only in stone and steel, but in the way humanity defines its own limits. If part one of Craigside marked the moment when electric light first rose over the mountains of Wales, part two begins when the house itself ceased to function merely as a residence and instead began to operate as a complete industrial system. At this stage, Craigside was no longer simply a mansion enhanced by technology. It became a living mechanism, a structure in which architecture, energy, labor, and landscape were bound together by a single controlling vision. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, Craigside expanded relentlessly. New wings were added not according to symmetry, but according to function. Corridors stretched and bent to follow the mountainside. Staircases multiplied. Service areas grew behind walls designed to conceal their presence. The result was not a palace in the classical sense, but something closer to an industrial organism, growing layer by layer in response to technical necessity rather than aesthetic restraint. At the heart of this organism lay water. High above the house, streams were redirected and shaped into reservoirs, carefully positioned to maximize gravitational force. From these elevated pools, water descended through stone channels and iron pipes, driving turbines hidden from view. Energy was generated not in a distant factory, but within the estate itself, transforming Craigside into a self-contained power station disguised as a country house. This integration of infrastructure into domestic life was unprecedented. Electricity at Craigside did not serve a single function. It illuminated rooms, powered mechanical devices, operated lifts, and supported experimental systems that blurred the boundary between home and laboratory. Technology was no longer an accessory. It became the organizing principle of daily existence. Yet for all its innovation, Craigside was designed to hide its machinery. Guests moved through richly furnished rooms without seeing wires, turbines, or pipes. Power flowed invisibly through thick stone walls. This concealment was deliberate. True authority, in Armstrong's view, did not announce itself loudly. It functioned quietly, efficiently, and without disruption. Control was most complete when it went unnoticed. The effect of this design philosophy was subtle but profound. Craigside existed in a different temporal rhythm from the world around it. While nearby villages remained governed by daylight and seasonal change, life inside the house followed the constant pulse of machinery. Night no longer imposed limits. Weather became irrelevant. The environment inside Craigside was regulated, predictable, and engineered. This separation created distance, not only physical, but social. The comforts enjoyed within the estate depended on labor and resources drawn from far beyond its boundaries. Coal, steel, and human effort flowed inward, sustaining a level of domestic autonomy unattainable for most of society. Craigside functioned as a microcosm of the industrial system itself, concentrated power at the center, supported by invisible networks extending outward. For those who worked within the house, this reality was unmistakable. Servants and technicians maintained the systems that allowed Craigside to appear effortless. They monitored pressure levels, repaired mechanical failures, and ensured that the lights never dimmed. The silence of the grand rooms was upheld by constant activity behind closed doors. Comfort was not natural. It was produced. As the systems grew more complex, so too did their demands. Maintenance became continuous. Small failures risked cascading consequences. Craigside required vigilance, expertise, and expense. It could not simply be inhabited. It had to be managed. In this way, Craigside exposed a contradiction at the core of industrial ambition. The same technologies that promised liberation from natural limits imposed new dependencies. Freedom from darkness required constant power. Independence from nature required perpetual intervention. The house achieved mastery over its surroundings, but only by binding itself to a level of complexity that left no room for neglect. By the late 19th century, Craigside stood as both achievement and warning. It demonstrated what industrial thinking could accomplish when applied without compromise. And it quietly revealed the cost of that accomplishment. A cost measured not only in resources, but in permanence. For a structure built on continuous optimization could never truly rest. It could only continue or fail. As Craigside entered the final years of the century, it remained intact, functional, and astonishing. Yet beneath its stability lay an unspoken question. What would happen when the vision that sustained this system no longer guided it? What future awaited a house that had been designed not merely to be lived in, but to prove that control itself could be perfected? That question lingered in the corridors, unspoken but unavoidable, as Craigside approached the moment when its greatest strength, total integration, would begin to reveal its greatest vulnerability. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Craigside remained outwardly unchanged. The lights still burned steadily. Water continued to flow through channels cut into the mountainside decades earlier. The machinery still obeyed the logic imposed upon it. And yet, beneath this appearance of continuity, the meaning of the house had begun to shift in ways that were subtle, irreversible, and deeply revealing. The world that had once made Craigside extraordinary was catching up. Electricity, which had been a private marvel within these stone walls, was spreading outward into cities, factories, and public streets. What had once distinguished Craigside as radically ahead of its time was becoming, slowly but inevitably, a shared reality. Progress was no longer confined to a single estate. It was becoming systemic, distributed, and impersonal. This change exposed a quiet irony. Craigside had been designed to embody the future, yet it was rooted in a vision of progress that depended on exclusivity. Its systems functioned because they served one household, one will, one controlling intelligence. As technology moved beyond the realm of individual mastery and into collective infrastructure, Краigside's model began to feel increasingly isolated, not obsolete, but incomplete. At the same time, the house's internal complexity grew more demanding. The very integration that had once been its greatest strength now required constant attention. Pipes aged. Turbines needed adjustment. Electrical components, experimental by nature, required replacement and refinement. Craigside could not simply endure. It had to be actively sustained, continuously recalibrated against the erosion of time. This dependency revealed a truth rarely acknowledged during the height of industrial optimism. Systems designed for perfect control do not age gracefully. They demand renewal or collapse. And renewal requires resources, financial, technical, and human, in perpetuity. Within Craigside, the experience of space also began to change. Rooms that had once felt like expressions of possibility now carried a different weight. Their scale no longer suggested freedom, but responsibility. Their silence no longer conveyed mastery, but vigilance. The house was not failing, but it was no longer effortless. It had become aware of itself. Beyond its walls, society was entering a period of questioning. Labor movements challenged the moral foundations of industrial wealth. Engineers and reformers debated the costs of unchecked expansion. The idea that technology alone could resolve human struggle began to fracture under the pressures of inequality and conflict. Craigside, though physically removed from these debates, was nonetheless shaped by them. It existed as a concentrated artifact of a worldview that was losing its certainty. When William Armstrong died in 1900, Craigside did not collapse. There was no immediate crisis, no dramatic decline, but the loss of its guiding intellect marked a turning point. The house had been an extension of a singular mind, adaptive, experimental, endlessly engaged. Without that presence, Craigside remained operational, yet directionless. Its systems could function, but they could not evolve on their own. This transition exposed the deepest vulnerability of Краigside's design. It was not built to change hands easily. It was not a neutral framework awaiting new interpretation. It was an intensely personal system, tuned to the preferences, habits, and ambitions of one individual. In the absence of that individual, the house did not rebel, it simply waited. Waiting, however, is not a passive state. Time continued its work. Maintenance costs accumulated. Certain areas of the house fell into reduced use, not through decay, but through redundancy. The future Craigside had anticipated was arriving, but not in the form it had imagined. In this period, Craigside ceased to function as a prototype and began to resemble something else entirely: a record. A physical document of a moment when faith in engineering bordered on certainty, when control felt not only possible, but righteous. The house no longer pointed forward. It began to reflect backward. What emerged was not failure, but limitation. Craigside demonstrated that technological mastery, when detached from social adaptability, could not sustain its own relevance indefinitely. The systems remained impressive. The vision remained bold. But the world no longer required a single house to prove what industry could achieve. As the 20th century approached, Craigside stood intact yet transformed, not by damage, but by context. The house had not changed. History had. And in that quiet shift, the story of Craigside entered its most revealing phase, no longer as a declaration of the future, but as a question posed to it. At the dawn of the 20th century, Craigside did not fall into ruin, nor was it abruptly abandoned. Instead, it entered a far more ambiguous state, one shared by many grand industrial estates of the Victorian era, a condition of quiet displacement, unchecked, in which a structure remains intact, while the world that once justified its existence moves on without it. The new century arrived carrying forces that Craigside had not been built to confront. Industrial power was no longer concentrated in singular figures whose personal vision could shape entire environments. It was becoming corporate, bureaucratic, and increasingly detached from the domestic sphere. Technology, once a marker of elite control, was turning into public infrastructure. Electricity spread outward through cities and factories, regulated by municipalities rather than individuals. What Craigside had pioneered in isolation was now being standardized elsewhere. This shift altered the meaning of the house in ways that no architectural modification could correct. Craigside had been conceived as a private command center, a place where energy, space, and daily life were unified under one controlling intelligence. But the 20th century favored separation. Work moved into offices and plants. Power generation moved into centralized grids. Homes, even wealthy ones, were no longer expected to function as autonomous systems. Craigside's greatest innovation became its greatest incompatibility. Economics compounded the problem. The financial conditions that had sustained vast private estates began to erode. Progressive taxation, rising labor costs, and the increasing scrutiny of industrial fortunes placed pressure on properties that demanded constant upkeep. Craigside was not merely large, it was technically demanding. Its systems could not be ignored without consequence. Every turbine, pipe, and circuit carried with it an obligation to maintain a level of complexity few owners could justify. As a result, the house began to contract in practice, even if not in form. Certain rooms were used less frequently. Entire wings slipped into dormancy. This was not decay, but selective withdrawal, an attempt to reduce the living footprint of a structure designed for perpetual expansion. Craigside adapted by retreating, not because it had failed, but because it had exceeded the scale of contemporary life. Outside, the landscape responded differently. Gardens once carefully controlled grew looser, less regimented. Water systems remained functional, but their dominance softened as natural processes reasserted themselves. The relationship between house and environment shifted from command to coexistence. Nature was no longer being optimized. It was being allowed back in. Culturally, Craigside entered a period of reevaluation. It was no longer seen as a blueprint for the future, but as a specimen of the past. Engineers, historians, and architects began to look at the house not for solutions, but for insight. It became a case study, not in how to build the modern world, but in how a particular vision of modernity had once been imagined. This reevaluation did not diminish Краigside's importance. It transformed it. The house ceased to compete with the present, and instead began to speak for its moment in history. Its value shifted from functional relevance to interpretive depth. Craigside no longer needed to operate flawlessly to matter. It needed to endure. Yet endurance itself posed a question. How long could a house built as an experiment remain legible once the experiment had concluded? Craigside was not neutral architecture. It was ideologically charged, shaped by confidence in engineering as a total solution. Without that confidence, the house stood exposed not as a failure, but as a monument to belief. By the time the world entered the turbulence of global conflict, Craigside was already receding from prominence. It had not been rejected. It had simply been overtaken. The future it had anticipated arrived differently, distributed across systems and societies, rather than concentrated within stone walls. Part 4 marks this quiet turning point. Craigside did not collapse under the weight of time. It drifted out of alignment with it. And in that misalignment, the house began to assume a new role, not as a place that shaped history, but as a place that recorded it. By the middle decades of the 20th century, Craigside stood closer than ever to a fate that had already claimed countless industrial-era estates' quiet erasure. Not destruction by fire or demolition, but the slower, more final process by which a place loses relevance, loses resources, and eventually loses its right to remain. The pressures were not unique to Craigside. Across Britain, large private houses built during the Victorian age struggled to survive in a world that no longer supported their scale or complexity. The economic foundations that had once sustained such properties had fractured. Progressive taxation reduced inherited wealth. Labor costs rose sharply. Domestic service, once abundant and inexpensive, became scarce. Houses designed to function through constant human oversight suddenly found themselves without the workforce required to keep them alive. Craigside faced an additional burden. Unlike many country houses, it was not merely large, it was technical. Its survival depended on systems that could not simply be ignored. Water channels had to be monitored. Electrical components aged. Mechanical infrastructure required knowledge that was becoming increasingly specialized and increasingly costly. The house did not decay dramatically. Instead, it hovered in a state of arrested complexity, where doing nothing was not an option, but doing everything was no longer feasible. Gradually, difficult decisions were made. Portions of the house were closed. Activity concentrated in a reduced number of rooms. The estate's operational footprint shrank, not as an act of neglect, but as an act of survival. Craigside was being simplified against its will, stripped of the total integration that had once defined it. During this period, Craigside faced its most serious threat, not physical collapse, but cultural invisibility. A building can endure decades of disuse and still be restored, but once it loses narrative importance, its survival becomes precarious. Craigside risked being remembered only as an impractical curiosity, too industrial to be romantic, too domestic to be monumental. Yet it was precisely this ambiguity that began, slowly, to work in its favor. As historical perspectives shifted after the Second World War, scholars and preservationists began to look differently at the industrial past. Factories, power systems, and engineering works were no longer seen solely as utilitarian relics. They were recognized as cultural artifacts, expressions of how societies once understood progress, control, and human potential. Craigside, viewed through this emerging lens, was suddenly legible in a new way. It was not merely a house, it was a document. Unlike factories that had been modernized beyond recognition or demolished for redevelopment, Craigside retained its original systems within their architectural context. The turbines, channels, wiring, and spatial logic of the house remained intact enough to tell a coherent story. This integrity distinguished Craigside from other estates, whose industrial elements had been removed or hidden in later renovations. Recognition alone, however, did not guarantee survival. Preservation required intervention, funding, and institutional commitment. The question was no longer whether Craigside had historical value, but whether that value justified the effort required to protect it. The turning point came when Craigside entered the care of the National Trust. This transfer did not signal a return to past grandeur. It marked a shift in purpose. Craigside would no longer be sustained as a private environment, optimized for comfort and control. It would be preserved as evidence, stabilized rather than perfected, interpreted rather than revived. This distinction mattered. Restoration did not aim to make Craigside new again. It aimed to make it readable. Systems were conserved not to demonstrate efficiency, but to demonstrate intention. Where was not erased, but contextualized. The house was allowed to carry the marks of its own excess. Through this transition, Craigside crossed an invisible boundary. It ceased to be an endangered estate and became a protected memory. Not a nostalgic one, but a critical one, preserved, not because it represented an ideal, but because it embodied a question the modern world still struggled to answer. What should be done with places built on ambitions that can no longer be sustained, but cannot be dismissed? Part 5 ends at this threshold. Craigside had not yet been fully reclaimed by public consciousness, but it had escaped disappearance. Its survival was no longer accidental. It was intentional, and with that intention came a new responsibility to speak honestly about the world that had produced it. When Craigside entered public stewardship, the house did not simply change hands. It changed voice. What had once spoken exclusively for the ambitions of a single industrial mind was now asked to speak for an era, and to do so with honesty rather than celebration. Opening Craigside to the public required a careful, deliberate reframing. The goal was not to recreate the experience of living there, nor to present the house as a monument to comfort or wealth. Instead, Craigside was positioned as an interpretive space where visitors could encounter the full complexity of an industrial worldview embedded in stone, water, and wiring. The house would no longer perform efficiency. It would explain intention. This shift altered how every room was understood. Drawing rooms and dining spaces were no longer endpoints of luxury, but entry points into a larger system. Visitors were guided, not only through decorated interiors, but through the logic that connected them. The routes water took from the mountains, the pressure required to turn turbines, the decisions that placed machinery behind walls, thick enough to silence it. Craigside became legible as a network rather than a sequence of rooms. One of the most striking aspects of this public interpretation was restraint. The house was not dramatized. There were no attempts to overwhelm with spectacle or nostalgia. Instead, the experience emphasized quiet continuity. Systems were preserved in place, not polished into novelty. The aim was to allow visitors to sense the discipline required to maintain such integration and the fragility inherent in sustaining it over time. Importantly, Craigside was not reframed as a simple precursor to modern sustainability. While its early use of hydroelectric power was acknowledged as remarkable, it was contextualized within its true motivation, autonomy, and control, not environmental ethics. This distinction mattered. It prevented the house from being absorbed into comforting narratives of technological inevitability and instead preserved its historical specificity. As Craigside entered educational programs and scholarly discussion, it became a reference point for understanding how industrial thinking migrated from factories into domestic life. The house illustrated a moment when the boundaries between production and habitation blurred, when technological mastery was not yet separated into grids, utilities, and institutions, but concentrated within private space. Public access also revealed something subtler. Craigside's power lay not in what it explained explicitly, but in what it allowed visitors to infer. Walking through its corridors, one could sense the imbalance between scale and need, between ingenuity and permanence. The house did not accuse, it simply endured, allowing its proportions and systems to speak for themselves. In this new role, Craigside became a place of comparison. Visitors arrived with modern assumptions about energy, automation, and convenience, only to encounter a structure that achieved many of those goals through labor-intensive, fragile means. The contrast was instructive. It underscored how far technology had traveled and how dependent it remained on hidden systems. Craigside's silence, once a marker of control, took on a different meaning. It became reflective rather than authoritative. The house no longer claimed mastery over its environment. It invited contemplation about the costs of seeking such mastery in the first place. By the time Craigside fully settled into its public identity, it was no longer an object competing with the present. It had become a lens through which the present could be examined. The house did not tell visitors what to think about progress. It offered a space in which progress could be questioned. Part 6 marks this transformation. Craigside survived not by adapting to modern life, but by refusing to pretend it belonged to it. In doing so, it gained a new relevance, not as a model to be replicated, but as a memory to be understood, preserved, and quietly interrogated. By the time Craigside had fully entered the public imagination, it no longer belonged to the story of a single man, nor even to the singular narrative of Britain's industrial ascent. The house had crossed into a different category of meaning. It was no longer an achievement to be admired, nor a relic to be mourned. It had become a question, one that lingered quietly in stone and water, waiting for each generation to answer in its own way. Craigside's significance now lay less in what it accomplished than in what it revealed. It showed how confidence in technology could harden into certainty, and how certainty could shape not only machines, but space, habit, and belief. The house had been designed around the idea that progress was something that could be planned in advance, engineered into permanence, and insulated from the unpredictability of society and nature alike. For a time, that idea appeared to hold. Yet history does not reward ideas for their coherence alone. It tests them against time, scale, and repetition. What Craigside demonstrated, in retrospect, was not the failure of industrial ambition, but its limits. The systems worked. The lights came on. The water turned the turbines. But the world that followed did not organize itself around such total integration. Progress moved outward, not inward. It dispersed. In this dispersal, Craigside lost its role as a prototype and gained a new one as a mirror. Visitors no longer came to see what the future might look like, but to confront how the future had once been imagined. The house offered no instructions. It offered perspective. Its corridors invited reflection rather than movement. Its silence encouraged thought rather than awe. What made this transformation possible was restraint. Craigside was not simplified for comfort, nor dramatized for effect. Its complexity was preserved intact, allowing the tension between ambition and sustainability to remain visible. The house did not resolve that tension. It held it. In an age increasingly defined by invisible systems, digital networks, automated grids, abstract flows of energy and data, Craigside reasserted the physicality of progress. It reminded viewers that every system once required material sacrifice, spatial dominance, and continuous human intervention. The seamlessness modern society takes for granted was once heavy, noisy, and fragile. Craigside also unsettled the idea that innovation is inherently democratic. Its early electrification did not serve a community. It served a household. Its autonomy was achieved not through shared infrastructure, but through concentrated power. Seen from the present, this raises uncomfortable questions about who benefits when technology arrives early, and who bears the cost. None of this diminished the intelligence or creativity that built Craigside. Instead, it reframed them. Armstrong's vision was neither naive nor malicious. It was logical within its moment. The house stands today, not as a condemnation of that logic, but as evidence of its historical boundaries. As Craigside settled into this role, it ceased to demand interpretation and began to invite it. Historians, engineers, environmental thinkers, and visitors each encountered a different version of the same question. How much control is enough? At what point does optimization become excess? And what remains when ambition outpaces its context? Part 7 does not offer answers. Craigside itself does not offer answers. It offers endurance. It allows the questions to persist, anchored to a place that once believed such questions could be solved permanently. In that sense, Craigside achieved a form of relevance its creator never intended. Not relevance through dominance, but relevance through humility. The house did not outlast time by conquering it. It outlasted time by allowing itself to be read, again and again, through changing eyes, as Craigside continued its life as a preserved site. A quiet but decisive transition took place. The house crossed an invisible threshold, where history ceased to belong to the person who created it and became the property of collective memory. What Craigside had been intended to prove no longer mattered as much as what it now allowed others to question. In this stage of its existence, Craigside was no longer measured by performance. The turbines no longer needed to demonstrate efficiency. The lighting systems no longer needed to impress. Instead, the house was understood as a fixed point in time, a material record of how confidence in engineering once shaped the way power, comfort, and control were imagined. Craigside stopped pointing forward. It began to look outward. This shift altered the way the house was read. Its hydroelectric system, once celebrated as a triumph of innovation, became evidence of a deeper impulse, the desire for autonomy at any cost. The redirection of streams and reshaping of the mountainside were no longer viewed solely as clever solutions, but as assertions of authority over nature. What had once felt visionary now invited ethical scrutiny. Craigside resisted simplification. It could not be comfortably labeled as either a triumph of sustainability or a cautionary tale of excess. It existed between those categories, complicating both. The house demonstrated that technological ingenuity and environmental domination could coexist within the same structure, driven by the same logic. This ambiguity became central to its value as a historical site. For modern visitors, Craigside often produced an unexpected reaction. Rather than awe, there was unease. Rather than admiration, there was reflection. The house felt controlled, but not warm. Efficient, but not generous. Its rooms conveyed intention rather than intimacy. This emotional distance was not accidental. It was the consequence of a space designed to operate flawlessly, not to adapt emotionally. In this way, Craigside revealed a rarely acknowledged aspect of industrial ambition. When environments are engineered primarily for control, they can lose their capacity to evolve with human need. Craigside had not been designed to grow old gracefully. It had been designed to function perfectly in perpetuity. History, however, does not permit perpetuity. As decades passed, Craigside's meaning continued to drift further from its origins. It was no longer discussed primarily in terms of its owner, but in terms of the mindset it represented. Armstrong's name faded into context, while the house itself remained central. Craigside became a proxy through which broader questions about power, progress, and legacy could be explored. This detachment from its creator was not a loss. It was a transformation. Craigside gained durability precisely because it no longer required loyalty to a single narrative. It could accommodate reinterpretation without losing integrity. Its stone walls did not dictate meaning. They held it. By the time Craigside fully entered the modern era as a site of reflection, its silence had changed character. Once, silence signified control. Now, it signified distance, the space between what was intended and what endured. The house no longer asserted mastery. It waited. Part 8 marks the moment when Craigside became fully historical. Not frozen, not romanticized, but released from the burden of justification. It no longer needed to succeed or fail. It needed only to remain present, allowing its contradictions to speak in a world increasingly shaped by technologies just as confident, just as ambitious, and just as uncertain about their eventual cost. To fully understand Craigside, it must be removed, if only conceptually, from its mountainside setting and placed within the broader geography of industrial ambition. Craigside was never an isolated anomaly. It was part of a wider, transatlantic moment in which wealth, technology, and confidence converged to reshape not only economies, but the spaces in which power chose to live. In the United States, the late 19th century produced estates that expressed industrial success in a very different language. Biltmore Estate, built by the Vanderbilt family, did not attempt to integrate machinery into daily life in the way Craigside did. Instead, it translated industrial wealth into scale, vast rooms, endless corridors, and a landscape designed to overwhelm through abundance. Where Craigside compressed power into systems, Biltmore expanded it across space. One sought mastery through control, the other through excess. Across the Atlantic again, Britain offered another variation. Waddesdon Manor represented a choice to convert industrial and financial power into cultural authority. Technology existed there, but discreetly. Art, architecture, and social ritual dominated the narrative. Waddesdon did not try to prove the future. It sought to inherit the past. In this context, Craigside stands apart, not interested in tradition or spectacle, but in functional dominance over environment. Elsewhere, a parallel development unfolded outside the domestic sphere entirely. At places like Edison Laboratory, technology was separated from living space. Innovation became institutional rather than personal. Power generation, experimentation, and invention moved into dedicated facilities, signaling a shift that would define the 20th century. The house was no longer the laboratory. The city was. Seen against this global backdrop, Craigside appears less like a prototype that failed and more like a path not taken. It represents a moment when it was still conceivable that a single individual might unify energy production, technological experimentation, and daily life within one private domain. The world that followed rejected that concentration, not because it was impossible, but because it was inefficient, inequitable, and ultimately unscalable. This comparison clarifies Краigside's unique position. Unlike American estates, it was not designed primarily for display. Unlike European cultural houses, it did not seek legitimacy through history. And unlike industrial campuses, It did not divide labor from life. Craigside attempted something rarer and more fragile: total integration. That ambition carried consequences. Integrated systems amplify both success and vulnerability. When they work, they appear seamless. When they falter, they expose their dependence on constant oversight. The global shift toward distributed infrastructure, public grids, standardized utilities, institutional research was, in part, a response to the risks embodied by places like Craigside. Yet Craigside's survival gives it a role its contemporaries cannot fulfill. While factories were modernized and laboratories replaced, Craigside remained intact enough to preserve the logic of its creation. It allows comparison not through abstraction, but through experience. One can walk its corridors and sense a world that believed coherence itself could be engineered. Placed beside the great estates and industrial centers of its era, Craigside does not diminish. It clarifies. It reveals that industrial ambition was never singular. It took multiple forms, each shaped by local culture, geography, and ideology. Craigside's form was introspective, controlled, and intensely personal. Part 9 widens the lens. Craigside is no longer just a Welsh house, nor even a British one. It becomes a case study in how different societies answered the same question: once technology grants power, where should that power reside? In private hands, in public systems, or in cultural symbols? Craigside answered decisively and briefly. The world answered differently. What remains is the dialogue between those answers, preserved in stone, steel, and water on a quiet mountainside, waiting to be compared rather than concluded. In the end, Craigside does not conclude its story with collapse, nor with redemption. It concludes with stillness. The lights no longer proclaim arrival. The machinery no longer argues for mastery. What remains is a house that has outlived the certainty that built it, standing quietly on a mountainside where time moves at its own pace. Craigside was created to prove that the future could be anticipated, engineered, and secured within stone walls. For a brief moment, that belief appeared justified. The systems worked, the house functioned, control seemed complete. But history does not reward confidence alone. It measures ideas against endurance, adaptability, and consequence. By those measures, Craigside offers neither victory nor defeat, only clarity. Looking back, Craigside did not fail because it was wrong. It failed to become universal because it was too specific. Its vision depended on concentration of wealth, of knowledge, of authority. The world that followed chose dispersion instead. Power grids replaced private turbines. Institutions replaced individuals. Homes separated from production. Progress continued, but it took another shape. And yet, Craigside remains. Not as a relic demanding reverence, but as a witness demanding attention. Its survival is not accidental. It persists because it captures a moment when humanity believed that complexity itself could be mastered, that optimization could be permanent, and that control could be humane if executed precisely enough. Walking through Craigside today, one senses the weight of that belief. The rooms are measured. The systems are deliberate. Nothing is casual. This was a house built without room for uncertainty. And that, perhaps, is its most revealing lesson. Because uncertainty did arrive. It arrived in the form of time, of social change, of moral reckoning. It arrived without drama. And Craigside, for all its ingenuity, could not contain it. The house adapted by becoming something else, not a machine for living, but a space for remembering. In this role, Craigside achieves a quieter significance. It allows modern viewers to recognize the costs embedded in ambition before those costs are forgotten. It shows that every system built to endure forever must eventually answer to a world it cannot control. Craigside does not tell us to reject progress. It tells us to question its shape. It asks whether efficiency, without flexibility, can survive compassion, whether control without humility can age with grace. These questions are not historical curiosities. They belong to the present. As evening settles over the Welsh mountains, and the house recedes into shadow, Craigside no longer asserts itself. It listens. It waits. It allows history to pass through it, layer by layer, without demanding agreement or admiration. That is its final transformation. Not a monument to industrial power, but a mirror held up to it. Not a promise of the future, but a reminder of how futures are imagined and what they ask in return. And in that silence, Craigside endures.